Hello and welcome to the Malika Writes channel. My name is Malika Writes and today I will be answering some questions that I got through Instagram. So I know that I've kind of been neglecting my Instagram questions, so I'm going to answer a few of them today. A lot of them have to do with The Hobbit actually. In the wake of The Rings of Power, a lot of people have been going back and watching the movies, and I've gotten a lot of stuff that wants me to comment on The Hobbit. So I apologize if this is a Hobbit filled movie, but that's the majority of the questions. So the first one is, what are your opinions about Tario and Keery? Okay, so Tario I think is a really good addition to the story, and so is Keery. However, their love story is not. The reason for this is I personally don't have an issue with dwarf and elf couplings. It's a bit weird because the dwarves and the elves have a really huge issue with each other. And it's not really that Tario is a random elf from a random kingdom. She is head of the guard for the Mirkwood Kingdom. So that means she is head of the guard for Thranduil. I can't say that name. For Thranduil. And he is related to, he is distantly related to Thingol, who was the king of Doriath back in the day. And Thingol was murdered by the dwarves, and the dwarves have a grievance because they think they were justified in that murder because Thingol wanted to rob them of something they had justly created. So there is a huge beef between the dwarves and the elves, and Thranduil is not going to be a fan of the dwarves. Neither are his people. So the fact that Tario is associated with him and she has this love story with a dwarf, I don't think it was sort of ramped up as much as it could be. I don't think the tension was ramped up as much as it could be. You have people notice, like Legolas, for example, but all he really does is call Keery ugly. He doesn't remind Tario of the history. That's kind of thrown out there. The dwarves also sort of notice Keely's flirtation with several with elves, for example, in when they're with Elrond and sort of staying at his house. Keely winks at this female elf in the extended edition, and no one really says anything. Like that, the elf is not necessarily startled that much, you know. People notice, they don't really say anything, but there is a very long-standing history of actual violence between the two of them, between the two races. So the fact that the relationship was treated so casually for me was a bit weird. Also, I think that if you're going to have a love story that complicated, as in you're having it between two races that have a long history of violence, it can't just end in the death of somebody. It has to have a bigger cause and effect. It needs to have a bigger effect on the story. So my main issue with Tario and Keely's love story is the fact that nothing really happens as a result of it. There's not a big catastrophic war. There's not a big change. Literally, you could take out the story and nothing would have changed. You would have just had less screen time. That would have been it. If your love story has no consequence, there is no need to have your love story. Arwen and Aragorn had consequence. It meant that Elrond would lose his child. It meant that Aragorn was going to go for the throne in order to win the hand of Arwen. It had consequence. There were, it meant that Sauron had somebody to threaten Aragorn with. There were a lot of consequences. Their love actually mattered to the story. Let's not even talk about Beren and Luthien, because that had a bunch of consequences. So if Tario and Keely could have not happened and nothing would have changed, you can go back and take them out and nothing changes. The war doesn't get averted because they're together. Keely dying, Tario just kind of goes back to her old life. Nothing happens. As a result, there is not this catastrophic strife between the two of them because of it. Thranduil threatens Tario once, and that's it. That's basically it. Nothing happens. You know, they've tried to do a really weak love triangle between Legolas, Tario, and Keery, and it doesn't work because they don't get enough screen time to develop that. It doesn't really matter. I mean, Tario saves Keery only for him to go on and die. So nothing actually changes as a result. That's my big issue. If you're going to put something in a book, if you're going to put something in a film, if you're going to put a gun in a film, it needs to go off at one point. That gun can't just be there for no reason at the end. That gun needs to go off. Somebody needs to be shot by that gun, and that killing needs to matter and change something in the entire story. And yeah, that was my biggest problem. It's not that I absolutely hated the pairing and oh my god, it was sacrilege to have them in there. No, I'm not that extreme. But I also don't like their coupling because it doesn't make sense. You can have that kind of coupling, but you have to make it make sense. It needs to work, and it didn't work, and that's why some people absolutely hate it. Tario, I think, was a good example of having an original character in the story and her fitting in, because she is not too standoutish. She's believable. We can believe that a character like this existed in the world of Middle-earth. So she fits well into the story. She looks like an elf, for one, Amazon. She actually looks like an elf. Just saying. Keery looks like a dwarf. Just saying. Yeah. Hold that. So, the next question is, how do you feel about the CGI in The Hobbit? Okay. When it comes to The Hobbit and CGI, that for me was one of the things that ruined The Hobbit. Yes, the 3 films were a bit much. I mean, when it comes to The Lord of the Rings, we actually had 3 books to turn into 3 films. The Hobbit is one book. It's one book. It didn't need 2 at most. 2 at most. A lot of what happens in the middle movie they could have found a way. Even if you wanted to make it, which is a stretch, it's a real stretch. But even if you wanted to make it 3, fine. Let's say 3 was what you wanted to do. I just feel like a lot of the CGI was what for me ruined it. Because in the original trilogy, a lot of the things were makeup and masks and real people running. The orcs were real. There was a sense of gravity to everything happening. But with the Hobbit, the CGI was a bit obvious. I mean, I know they spent a lot of money on it, but it was so obvious. Bomber rolling in the barrel, for example. Oh, that was horrific. That was really horrific. And it's not a case where you slow down and then you see it. No, as you're watching in the cinema, you could see it. You could see the sort of fakeness of it. Some of the stunts that Legolas does in The Hobbit, yes, you had some unnecessary stunts in The Lord of the Rings, for example, Legolas sliding on the shield. Okay, yeah, we get he's an elf and all that, but you can excuse those because for the most part, it's not extreme. In The Hobbit, however, we have Legolas basically playing Mario and running up some falling bricks. I was so confused because not only is the CGI extremely obvious, but when? How? What? When were the elves that powerful? I know that Legolas is not just a normal sort of elf. You know, he's royalty. But that was a bit much. You know, I know the elves are supposed to be extremely strong, but The Hobbit is taking place in the Third Age. where the elves are significantly weaker than the First Age? Why are they doing First Age stunts in the Third Age? It was a bit much for me. So I think that they need to definitely tone down the CGI in the Rings of Power and learn from The Hobbit, because from what I've observed, they're going for more Hobbit-esque looks. They're going for more Hobbit looking aesthetics in the Rings of Power, which I think could be a little bit of a mistake, just because if you rely that heavily on CGI, you're going in the wrong direction. So the next question, what is your opinion of Thranduil in The Hobbit? Okay, I love me some Lee Pace, so unfortunately, if you disliked him, I am not with you in that camp. You could call this me being biased, me fangirling, but the only critique I will give of Lee Pace, and this is me forcing myself because he's perfect and he never does anything wrong. The fight scenes. The fight scenes were they could have lost the cloak for me a little bit. There's a particular scene in the Battle of Five Armies where Thranduil is fighting the orcs, and it doesn't look as real as we are used to in the Lord of the Rings trilogy. That is the only critique I will give of Lee Pace. Other than that, he was perfect. He was everything I needed him to be and more. So that is my opinion. Yes, am I being biased? Will I continue to be biased? Hell yes. So yeah, that's it. That's me. Thank you. Of all the dwarves in the company, which were your favorites and why? Okay, I think my favorite dwarf has to be Fili. The reason for this is the amount of loyalty that he has towards Kili really kind of broke my heart, and filled my heart, then broke it when they died. So I really loved that dwarf. I think his relationship with his brother was just spectacular. You could really see the love. And it was just beautiful to see play out on screen. I think there was so much good chemistry between the two actors, and that was why he was my favourite dwarf, and his death tore me apart. I really liked Thorin. Yes, I think that Richard Armitage does a good job as Thorin, because when I read the Hobbit, was Thorin in the movie perhaps more conventionally charismatic than in the books? A little bit, but I do think that Thorin is sort of described as a charismatic speaker. So I didn't really care about the changes, because I do feel like his character came across. The sort of gruffness about him was a change they made, because in the book, Thorin is a little bit more polished and actually thinks of himself as very grand. So he makes an effort to come across as polished. Whereas Thorin in the movies is a lot more sort of grim and gritty, and he's sort of seen life and he's suffered, and he's a lot less grand. Yes, he has his smoldering hair in the wind moments, but he's a lot more, I won't say down to earth, because he's definitely still holding himself up as leader, but it's a lot more in the sort of the way that The Witcher kind of does it in a way, so where he's sort of the tortured leader. I've faced war, I know what it looks like, smouldering hair in the wind, but so I definitely did like that portrayal as well. I was not mad at that portrayal. I will see you next time on the Malika Writes channel. I hope you have a lovely day.